Good afternoon. I'm Prudence Beidler Carr, the director at the ABA Center on Children in the Law, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this webinar today, co-sponsored by the ABA Center on Children in the Law, the ABA Commission on Youth at Risk, and the ABA Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice. If you like the work that you see and are interested in engaging more, we'll have some follow-up information at the end of the presentation for how to be in touch. We're really excited to bring you today's program entitled How Adolescent Brain Science Supports Youth Engagement in Court Hearings and Case Planning. Our panelists today include Leslie Leve, who's from the College of Education at University of Oregon, Sue Mangold, who's the CEO of the Juvenile Law Center. We have Kristin Kelly, who's the Assistant Director of our Education Projects at the ABA Center on Children in the Law, and Sneha Barve, who's a staff attorney who handles a lot of our education work as well here at the ABA Center on Children in the Law. We'll be sharing the recording for those of you who are interested in sharing the link afterward with other colleagues, and that'll go out to all of the registered attendees and will be up available on our website. I should also let you know that during the webinar there will be an opportunity for questions, and so on your GoToWebinar site right now that you're on, you can post questions, and we'll be having a couple of segments during the presentation where we'll be pausing to address those questions with our expert panelists. I'd also like to begin by providing just a little bit of context about the ABA Center on Children in the Law and why we saw this as a great opportunity of something to share with the legal community in today's webinar. For those of you who aren't already engaged with our work, our mission at the Center on Children in the Law is to promote access to justice for children and families. We're a nonprofit entity within the much larger association, which has about 400,000 legal professionals. At the Center on Children in the Law, we have a team of attorneys and core staff who work on grant projects around the world, around the country, that are unified by two themes. The first is improving legal representation, and the second is improving the legal systems that impact children and families' lives. We do a lot of this work at the state, local, and regional level, as well as through a bunch of national partnerships. And we really seek, in many instances, such as today, to try and leverage the voice of the ABA and really make sure that the larger legal profession, not just practitioners who are directly engaged in child welfare and other types of cases that involve children and families, but to make sure that the entire legal profession is engaged and aware of how significant the child welfare legal system is as a legal system in our country. I want to say a special thanks to Sue Mangold, who serves on the Commission on Youth at Risk as part of our work. That's a commission of experts in the legal space who have been appointed by the ABA president to provide guidance on setting a policy agenda for using the ABA's voice on child and youth law topics every year. And so we're excited to have Sue on this webinar, both in her capacity as the CEO at Juvenile Law Center and as a volunteer who regularly informs our work. I wanted to begin with taking the sort of pulse of who our audience is. So we'll start in just a moment to do two polls, but I want to begin by giving people in the audience a sense of what the thank you, of what the presentation intends to do today. As you can tell from the panel up above, we have a lot of presenters, and we look forward to sharing a lot of information, but our sort of primary goals are to outline some of the, our primary goals are to outline some of the principles of adolescent brain science, to highlight the recommendations related to improving the child welfare system that were proposed in the National Academy of Sciences publication. The Promise of Adolescence, and to provide an opportunity to discuss how adolescent brain science impacts youth in foster care and how attorneys can best support adolescent clients. Within that, I wanted to actually start by just referencing a specific line in the introduction of the NAS report, which recognizes that over the last 2 decades, there are advances in neurobiology and neuroimaging that have demonstrated the dramatic extent of brain maturation during adolescence. However, this exciting advance in knowledge has not penetrated the everyday understanding of informed citizens and policymakers, including many who serve young people. And that is, I think, in a nutshell, exactly what the goal is with this webinar, which is to recognize that through the NAS report and through so much academic work looking at the importance of brain maturation during adolescence, there's a tremendous amount of advancement. But what we want to do, and what we are excited to see so many participants interested in doing as well, is taking that science and really making sure that it's applying in the day-to-day work of supporting adolescents in the child welfare legal system, whether as caseworkers, as attorneys, or as judges who are making decisions every day about adolescents. And so that's why we want to start by thanking you all for participating. We're excited that the registration rates were so high for this webinar. It really is a testament to, I think, the fact that this is a topic of interest to many in the legal community. And so thank you for all of the work that you do and for your interest in taking this information back to help in the ways that you support adolescents in your day-to-day work in the child welfare field and beyond. I'll start with the two polls that we're going to do. Bear with us because these will take just a moment as people fill them out. And then we'll get started with the webinar with Leslie leading us off. So in the first poll, if everyone can just fill out to give us a sense of the context of who's on the line, what kind of professional you are, and if you're not a legal professional, feel free to just fill in other. But if you are in one of these other categories, that'll be really helpful information. Great. Terrific. And then the second poll is for us to get a sense of who already has some background in this space. So the National Academies of Sciences, the Adolescent Brain Report came out several months ago, and there have been obviously other academic reports in this area. And so we're curious, excuse me, we're curious to know sort of who feels very familiar with this science, who feels somewhat familiar, and for whom is this entirely new material. Terrific. Great. Well, that's a good starting point. I think we will seek to reach each audience, but probably the ones that are looking for additional, who are not experts themselves yet. Thank you so much again, and Leslie, I will pass it to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Prudence. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here with the co-presenters, and as well, thank you, audience, for joining the webinar. My training is in developmental psychology, so I'm going to lead us off by talking a little bit about the kind of statement of purpose, the task at hand for the report, and then give a brief overview of the science. I'll start by also thanking the committee members on the last slide. This was really a diverse group that represented fields of developmental psychology, clinical psychology, the law, economics, sociology. So it was really cool to have different perspectives contributing to the knowledge behind the report. So our report, sponsored by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, we were tasked with sort of two broad things, looking at the neurobiological and socio-behavioral science of adolescent development. And I'm going to come back to those two terms, neurobiology and socio-behavioral, in the next few slides. And then really to explore, what knowledge do we have, and how can we apply that to institutional systems to really promote adolescents flourish, have positive well-being, and be resilient throughout adolescence and beyond. What are some of the barriers or structural inequalities in access and opportunity? And the report does focus on 4 systems, with child welfare being one of them. We also focused on the juvenile justice system, the health system, and the education system. But today, the focus of what we will present will be more specific to the child welfare and foster care system. And next slide, please. So just to start off, we thought in the report, and also for this audience, it was helpful to define adolescence, because people do have different definitions of adolescence, and sometimes it's conceived only as the teenage years. But really, we think in the report of adolescence as this broad period that spans the end of childhood toward the beginning of adulthood. So it really is this period from about age 10, typically around the onset of puberty, to all the way to early to even mid-20s, when the final stages of puberty are completed and also brain development is more stabilized. So it can be broken down into early, mid, late, and adolescence and young adulthood, but this whole span of adolescence is covered in the report because that is when there are a whole lot of hormonal changes, there's a lot of brain development happening, as well as changes in the socio-contextual environment. And if you could go forward to the next slide, please. And so another critical thing about adolescence is that adolescents are increasingly taking a large portion of our population. So it's over a fifth, nearly a quarter of the population, 22.6% of the United States population is between age 10 and 25. This is, just an enormous contribution to our society, and we're at a place in time where we really want to capitalize on the potential, the promise of adolescence and youth, because of what's happening, their readiness for receptivity to changes, to influence because of the brain changes, and because this is really a large number of our population that will continue into adulthood and be an active part of our workforce in the future. In addition, this population, adolescents between age 10 to 25, are going to become expected to become majority minority by this year. And what that means is that 50% or more are likely to be non-Latinx, non-white, non-Latinx persons. So that's another important point to think about health disparities and how to promote well-being for all adolescents, beginning in childhood, adolescence, and of course across the lifespan. And with the next slide, this is just essentially a summary here. Really, what I'll show you in the next few slides, I'll focus on the socio-behavioral aspects of development and the neurobiological aspects of development to try to make the point that relative to what's happening in childhood, adolescents are just at this prime point for having advanced decision-making skills, and we as society and our social systems are really well poised to help seek solutions that can really promote their well-being and their resilience in adolescence and then into adulthood. And so with the next few slides, I'll start with talking about the social behavioral context and highlight 4 changes that are really pronounced in adolescence that make it an ideal time to think about how to best support them. So one is identity development. So as those of you who work with adolescents know, this is a time when youth are really thinking about their own, who they are, what are their values, what are their beliefs, what are their aspirations. But what we know about identity is that it's constructed over time and can be deconstructed and reconstructed. And that the context that they're in, whether those are in the foster care, the judicial system, the school system, can help influence and affect the identity development. So that's just a critical part of adolescence, is they're thinking about who they are and what they want to be. And we know that the systems that they're in, the experiences they have, help shape that. So we want to do what we can to help those be positive experiences. Secondly, adolescents are, just going back to that last slide for a moment, some of the other points on that slide, they're developing new social relationships with peers and adults outside of the family. So whereas in childhood, they were primarily focused on their parents and immediate family, peer relationships and other adults outside of the family are increasingly important. Third, and related to these two, they're very attuned to their social status. And again, anyone who's had an adolescent or teen is likely aware of this, but there's a lot of social comparison and thinking about who they are as part of forming one's identity. And again, thinking about how system involvement might impact that is critical. And as part of all this, there's a growing capacity for self-direction. So they're well poised to make their own decisions, to have input into decisions about their education, about their health care, about their well-being. about their friends, that are critical for thinking about system influences. And on the next slide, I'll shift to talking about what's happening neurobiologically. So we know that in adolescence, the brain is becoming increasingly connected. And what we mean by that is there are different systems in the brain. Some are more contributing to language, some to emotions, some to behavior. And in adolescence, those systems are connecting in ways that they haven't done in childhood. And that's a good thing. We want, for example, if you're feeling emotional, we want that connect to your behavioral response system or to your language system so that you can have effective and appropriate responses. We also know as part of this, there's a heightened curiosity and reward sensitivity. So they're very attuned to and seeking of rewards, and in particular, short-term rewards over long-term rewards. So for example, given the option to sit and do homework or hang out with friends, adolescents will often choose the immediate reward of hanging out with friends because that's more appealing than thinking about the longer term benefits of if I do my homework, then I will pass this class and graduate from the class or the grade that I'm in. So coming along with all the changes in the brain they have increased cognitive abilities, so they can begin in better planning, they can think more logically, they're much more effective at problem solving than youth were in childhood. And overall, the final bullet here is really talking about this. The bottom line is that the way our brain is shaping and developing during adolescence is not just happening in a vacuum. It's very much connected to the social context that adolescents and youth are in. And what's happening in the world can affect the way the brain systems are connecting, the way the problem solving and cognitive abilities are developing. And that's a critical foundation of the report. On the next slide, I show a little bit of an illustration of this, just to put it into perspective. Essentially, there's two colors here. The boys are blue and the girls are in the reddish pinkish. And what you see, the timeline there are age. So if you look at kind of the age 10 to 25, which is the timeline we're talking about, you see an upward trend in brain connectivity. And what that's showing is that, again, during this period of 10 to 25, those brain systems are connecting much more harmoniously, much more in sync with each other, so that when a person feels an emotion, it's immediately connected to their language system and to their behavioral system in ways that can be very adaptive or maladaptive, depending on the way those connections have been formed. And so I put the picture of the sled over there to just show an example of what essentially is happening is that the brain is forming these patterns, these routines, almost like tracks in the snow from a sled. Whereas, you do the sled once and you form a little bit of a path, and then you make that pattern again and it becomes more ingrained and more patterned to the point that it can be hard to shift to a new track or new pattern. And that's exactly what's happening with the brain systems and these interconnection between the brain systems during adolescence. And what we'd like to do is help adolescents form these connections that are healthy and promotive of, positive behavior and pro-social actions, because when they start to get wired through our experiences in maladaptive patterns, it's not impossible to shift those tracks, but it's more difficult, and it takes some repeated patterning of the positive pathways to override existing pathways. And on the next slide, I'll talk for a second about, just to kind of summarize, essentially what we have in adolescence relative to childhood is just this unique period of the brain is developing, the connections are forming, adolescents are ready to make decisions, they're forming their identities, and it's just an ideal opportunity to set up social contexts and situations that are healthy and help them be prepared to meet the life challenges ahead. The almost final slide, this is sort of the last more technical kind of slide that I'll show here, is just talking about how adolescents are, how the environments shape adolescent development. So you could think, for example, of two children, perhaps genetically the same, biologically the same. So say, for example, identical twins. So even though they have the same gene, were born with the same genes and the same biology, What this diagram is showing is that our environments can really help shape development over time. So you can think of these two children that were the same biologically, and one perhaps is in a context where there's economic hardship, and that's going to harm their development over time, whereas the other one might be experiencing very positive, constructive parenting, maybe in a higher economic resourced area that will help them flourish over time. And you see these two pathways and some of the topics that we focused on the report that were positive outcomes, such as having positive parenting and having a positive school environment, having good access to care, and then once becoming adults or parents themselves, having appropriate social support and support for their own parenting, can help promote adolescent and young adult development over time. Whereas some of the barriers or challenges to healthy development would be things like economic hardship or having system involvement, such as juvenile justice involvement, or having job insecurity. So in summary, before I think I'm about ready to turn it over to Sue, on the final slide, I just want to say before turning it over to Sue that adolescence is really a period of great opportunity. It's this conflux of brain development, of pubertal development, of identity formation, of decision-making skills that make it really an ideal time to promote their learning and potentially address or ameliorate harmful effects or adverse experiences that they may have experienced during childhood. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Sue, to talk about how we then translated this to some of the contents of the report.
That's great. So the report works in a couple of ways. It has foundational chapters that set up the neuro and socio-behavioral science that Leslie just mentioned. There's a separate chapter on disparities in the adolescent population and experience. And that disparity information is woven through the 4 chapters that then follow on health, education, child welfare, and justice. So we're going to be focusing on the child welfare system today. But I just want to mention that throughout the report, there's useful information. So for instance, if you're interested in mental health research around adolescence in the child welfare system, there's more information about mental health and adolescence in the health chapter than there is in the child welfare chapter. If you're interested in more information about disparities in the child welfare system, there's more information in the chapter that's devoted to disparities than in the child welfare chapter. So we're going to be talking now about the child welfare system and thinking about how we might reimagine that system with the latest neuro and socio-behavioral science in mind. So historically, the child welfare system does not have adolescence as the paradigm, sort of system focus. It's focused much more on younger children and severely abused younger children. And so the whole mandatory reporting and investigation and record keeping system that's in place was really developed with the paradigm of a seriously abused young child at its core. So the system then has tried to adapt and evolve to encompass the full population, mostly neglected children, and including, of course, adolescents and youth transitioning from care. You can go to the next slide, please. You can go on to the next slide. And so over the past 2 decades, Congress has made significant advances, but we really need to take additional steps. So the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act was passed in 1980, which was the first law dealing with sort of regulating foster care at the federal level. In 1984, some independent living initiatives are introduced, but it's really not until 1999 with the Foster Care Independence Act that adolescents are particularly the focus of law governing the child welfare system. And there's been great advances since then. So states now have the option of keeping young people in care up to age 21. So extended foster care is an option for all states to receive federal funding. Most states participate in some form of extended foster care, but only half of the states have fully adopted extended foster care. And we'll talk about some of the challenges, even for those states that have adopted it, with making it developmentally appropriate. States can now receive federal funds up to age 23 for young people to receive wraparound services. For those of you engaged in the field of child welfare, those are often called Chafee services, named after Senator Chafee. But those can extend to age 23. Education vouchers can be in place until age 26 for youth who age out of the foster care system, and also for youth who are adolescents in the foster care system. They can stay on Medicaid up to age 26. So all of those advances past age 18 are recognizing this larger span of adolescence that Leslie introduced to us earlier in her remarks, extending to age 24 or 25. You can go to the next slide, please. One of the challenges is how adolescents experience the system. So as I say, the laws are in place, are pretty good, and we need to work on state uptake of those laws so that all states offer foster care to age 21, and all states offer wraparound services to age 23, and all states offer education and Medicaid to age 26. But there's still the challenge of the youth's perspective. And so young people may choose not to stay in extended foster care, or not to stay engaged in wraparound services, or not to seek education vouchers, because their experience as young children, but certainly as adolescents, has been challenging. And part of that is because the system is still set up as a system of protection more than empowerment. But as Leslie mentioned, in terms of increased decision-making, adolescence is a period where young people begin to be able to and need to be empowered to make their own decisions. And so these youth perspectives that were collected as part of the National Academies work were just some of the input that young people had in terms of their frustration with what was going on around them while they were an adolescent in the child welfare system in terms of their own cases. Meetings being scheduled around lawyers' time or social worker time, but not mindful of what might be going on for them in school or in their extracurriculars, being present at a meeting where everything is just going over their head and they're not prepared to participate, and during the meeting they're not included. Transportation that's not reliable, so gets them there late, and then they're waiting around afterwards to get home. You can go to the next slide, please. And similarly, their perspectives on supportive adults. Those of us who work in the field know that when youth transition out of care, they often return to the extended family or other supportive adults that they identify, even if the system has spent a lot of its energies keeping them away from these adults. And so struggling to build those supportive adult relationships that will help them on a successful trajectory towards adulthood. So you recall the slide that Leslie shared with us where there was upward and downward arrows, where positive experiences during adolescence help shift even a child who has suffered a lot of trauma at earlier periods of their childhood will help shift towards a more positive trajectory towards adulthood, whereas downward negative experience may create obstacles towards that positive trajectory towards adulthood. Here are some of the youth's views on the importance of supportive adults and on the need for the system to foster those relationships. You go to the next slide, please. So I think Leslie is going to join us again to walk us through some studies that have looked at this child welfare information.
Yeah. So this slide is in here just as one example of the kind of work that we did on the report, thinking about here are these policies that Sue just talked about. How do they connect to the research of what we know about child welfare? So this is one study coming out of Chapin Hall. And as Sue just talked about, the Fostering Connections Act gave states the option to extend age of foster care to 21. And this is a study using records data from California that looked at both before and sort of right after the Fostering Connections Act went into place, and looked at for each year after age 18 that a youth stayed in foster care, what was the likelihood that they would continue, that they would go on to advanced education. And the reason for looking at education was, of course, because overall this population tends to have very low rates of post-secondary school enrollment, and so that's a concern in terms of their overall pathway to well-being and success, having a voc tech degree or a college degree. And so what they found is that, post-act, for each year after age 18 that youth stayed in foster care, their likelihood of enrolling in post-secondary education went up by 4 percentage points. So 4 percentage points if they stayed till 19, 8 percentage points if they stayed till 20, et cetera. But what they also found, looking a deep dive at this was looking at all child welfare involved youth, but when you look specifically at probation supervised youth within that population, there was no benefit at all. So what that tells us is that, the policy is having some benefit for some youth in child welfare, but not the anticipated benefit, particularly for probation supervised youth. And so it really calls for efforts to redouble our efforts to prepare youth, particularly in that subgroup, before they're at the point of thinking about post-secondary education as well as after. And I'll turn it back to you, Sue.
So I want to share with you the recommendations that the National Academies of Sciences committee that Leslie and I both participated on developed for the child welfare system. And I do want to put a little bit of a post-it here to say, for those of you who perhaps are more familiar with ABA resolutions or CLEs that talk about how lawyers can be more effective, or materials, say, from Juvenile Law Center that have much more of an advocacy tone. We'll talk about some of those materials later in the webinar when we look at the ABA tools. But the recommendations that came out of the National Academy studies are based on and therefore limited by the research in the field. And one of our big challenges was the limited amount of both data and research focused on adolescents in the child welfare system. So although there are things that may seem logical or likely to flow from what we know about neuro and socio-behavioral development during the period of adolescence and relating it to the child welfare system, if we didn't have sort of evidence-based information on those recommendations, they're not things that we could include. So with that caveat, we saw, all along the way, and of course, many of you, if not all of you, listening to this webinar are aware of this, of racial and ethnic disparities in child welfare system involvement and the need to reduce that. Again, there is a separate chapter on the report that focuses specifically on some of the data, but really the report calls it out more than recommends solutions. And one of the things I would say to all of you who may sit on commissions or have the opportunity to influence in public discourse some of the data collection or data reporting of your local agencies, the more we can collect information on racial and ethnic information on youth in the child welfare system, and specifically on adolescents, I think the better prepared we will be to both make stronger recommendations, but also to give that information to advocates to take action. You can go to the next slide, please. As we mentioned, there are good laws in place at the federal level, but states, only about half of the states have taken up the opportunity to fully provide extended foster care to 21, Chafee services or wraparound services to 23, education and training vouchers to 26, and Medicaid to 26. And so the National Academies wants to promote the broad uptake by states of those federal programs. And we included in the study those youth perspectives so that we are mindful that it's not just states that need to take up these federal opportunities, but that local districts and jurisdictions need to construct the child welfare system in such a way that adolescents want to stay involved. We'll go to the next slide, please. And that goes directly to this, that the system needs to be developmentally informed, both at the individual level, and so the child or the adolescent needs to experience that this is a system that is meant to be serving them, not a system for little kids that they can't wait to get out of. At the program level, the system needs to be mindful of the latest adolescent development science, so that programs available to adolescents aren't developed for a paradigm 8 or 9-year-old or even younger, but instead are created with adolescents and older adolescents in mind. And then at the system level, so that the whole system is shaped such that foster care recruitment, everything is mindful of the developmental science and the particular needs of adolescents who are moving towards more decision making and more empowerment, as well as needing protection. The next slide, please. It's very important, as I mentioned in my caveat at the beginning, that we conduct more research in this area. And so to the extent that any of you have influence on some of those decisions, or if a study is going on, ask the questions about, and how does it affect adolescents? So we're able to learn more about this population. There is a lot we know about the science, and not so much that we know about some of the systems, and in particular, the child welfare system. There was a dearth of information. And I do want to mention that the National Academies has never done a study on status offenses, so truancy, incorrigibility, ungovernability, and in part that's because of the dearth of research on the population served by those systems. The next slide, please. It's very important that the child welfare system collaborate, not just with the juvenile justice system when there are crossover or dually involved youth, but with the health and the education systems. And this may seem like a no-brainer, but what we saw in much of our work was that, especially as adolescents get older, that collaboration falls apart as adolescents are able to access their own mental health services or reject mental health services, seek drug and alcohol services or reject drug and alcohol services. The collaboration and the coordination within the systems falls apart. And that's part of that system structuring, so that it's developmentally informed in terms of how adolescents travel through the child welfare system and interact with health, education, and juvenile justice. And the last recommendation is really focused on what those of us in advocacy, not in the NAS report, refer to as the child welfare to prison pipeline. So many of you, if not all of you, have heard of the school to prison pipeline, but there's a very real challenge for young people getting involved with the juvenile justice system or the adult criminal system when they exit the foster care system. And the caution that non-criminal misconduct in group homes, in congregate care settings, by children in foster care needs to be treated as it would be if these young people were in families where parents were providing advocacy to keep them away from the harshest consequences of their adolescent behavior. And so a reminder that non-criminal misconduct should never result in justice system involvement. You can go to the next slide. So in summary, we all have a collective responsibility to embrace and hold accountable our systems so that they are using the latest science and are developmentally informed, and so that system involvement is a positive upward arrow towards a positive trajectory toward adulthood, as opposed to a negative downward area that takes young people who have already suffered trauma and makes it less likely that they will be successful in their adulthood. So the adolescent science is really giving us some pretty strong recommendations that we need to pick up in these systems to create as positive and supportive an experience as the young people can enjoy. You can go to the next slide. Research has really fundamentally changed how we think about young people, but now, as Leslie and I have both discussed, we need to embrace this research, and that's why the committee was called the Committee on Adolescent Neuro and Socio-Behavioral Science and its Applications. So Leslie and the team of scientists represented the neuro and socio-behavioral science, and those of us from the advocacy community were invited to participate in this NAS committee to bring forward the applications. You can go to the next slide, and Prudence, I think you can invite questions at this point.
Yes, I think we have a couple of questions that we'll try to tackle before transitioning to the next portion of the webinar. The first one, I think, Sue, ties in with both recommendation 8.2 about sort of greater investment in this area from a public standpoint, and the 8.6, which is really looking at sort of the intersection of different systems and especially transition age youth. And so the question was focused on how, like, what ideas you have, or, and maybe this is more the advocacy side, but what ideas you have for how to encourage a greater degree of state and local public investment in transition age youth, and in a recognition that transition age youth who are exiting foster care need to have a sense of social inclusion and need to have sort of a long-term trajectory of being a part of a community. And so I guess the core of the question is, what are some ideas of ways that communities can do a better job of that and can reinforce the importance of public investment in that?
Well, I think it really starts with the first recommendation that states need to participate in extended foster care. You can go to the National Extended Foster Care Review page on Juvenile Law Center's website, jlc.org. The National Extended Foster Care is a database of information how each state is participating in terms of the uptake in extended foster care. So I guess it would start with saying that kids need to stay in care, and then what are they receiving when they're in care? And then that goes to the state's uptake of the CHAFE services and the vouchers, both for vouchers for training and education, and how they introduce young people and get them connected to Medicaid up to age 26. In terms of the programs themselves and what they might look like that we want to invest in, the report contains a couple of model programs that are around integration of education and the foster care system, but there's not a lot of information about kind of programs that work, that have been researched and are contained in the study. At Juvenile Law Center, we have some toolkits from our youth advocacy programs. So we have, each year we hire 15 young people with experience in the foster care system in our group called Youth Fostering Change. And they have toolkits around permanency planning and court involvement that I think lend a lot of good information in terms of what would make the system more beneficial to adolescents in care, and therefore how states and local jurisdictions should invest. I don't know if you have anything to add, Leslie.
I do have one thing to add, which is a recent survey from the Pew Educational Trust showed that as a population at large, youth, young adults, or late adolescents are staying at home longer than they have, I think, back since World War II. So you have the average, many youth are staying at home till they're 24, 25, 26. And that's giving them opportunities, gives them more financial stability. They don't have to pay for their own rent. It gives them additional skills, role modeling. And so if we're not providing those same opportunities for youth in foster care, we're really potentially increasing this disparity, this disadvantage for youth who are system involved.
Terrific. And one of the follow-up questions on that was about whether the NAS committee or other research that you know of has examined whether other countries are places to look for additional models of sort of promising practices and good supportive work around helping youth transition, especially if they've been in a system like a child welfare system.
The report really was focused on the U.S. context, in part because it was a National Academies report. So it did not cover international research. And Sue, I don't know if you know of any research, but at least in Europe, I cannot think of models that have done this successfully yet.
So the MacArthur Foundation has funded us every other year to participate internationally, focused more on the juvenile justice system. But what I bring particularly to that group is a focus on crossover youth. So youth who are in the foster care system are arrested and wind up in the justice system. And I would say in terms of that relationship between the justice and child welfare system, there are infinite models of better ways to handle the transition of youth from the foster care system and to handle juvenile justice, period. And I'd be happy, as Leslie said, it wasn't in the Academy studies, but anyone can contact me and I'd be happy to share some of that information with them.
Terrific. And we have a couple of other questions that have come in, but with an eye on the time, I want to transition to the other two speakers. But I will also share that we will seek to follow up on some of these questions, and you all can see the contact information for the staff who have been involved with the NAS report, and we'll have some additional contact information at the end of the presentation. So to sort of bring it back to where we began the discussion at the beginning of this presentation about recognizing that over the past 2 decades, there's been this tremendous amount of research and scientific discovery around the importance of adolescent brain development. The last portion of the presentation today, building on Sue and Leslie's presentation, is to say sort of what does that mean for the huge percentage of you who noted that you're attorneys representing children and youth, or attorneys representing parents, or child welfare agencies, and for those of you who are stakeholders or advocates in other ways, what are some of the concrete ways that all of this research and this development really applies in your direct practice? And for that, I'm going to pass it to Kristin Kelly and Sneha.
Hi, everyone. I'll give Sneha a second to get her webcam going, but we're excited to be here today. And thank you so much to Leslie and Sue. Despite the work that we've been doing on adolescent brain science, I learned a lot and really enjoyed your presentation. So thank you so much.
Great. So with funding from the Annie Casey Foundation's Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative, the ABA has put together several resources into a bit of a toolkit for attorneys, but we think it'll also be helpful to other child welfare practitioners as well. And the toolkit contains 4 separate pieces. There is sort of an article that explains broadly about what we know about the science and how attorneys can better connect and engage authentically with youth in care. We also have case scenarios and a sort of train the trainer piece to the toolkit as well. The Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative frames a lot of their resources around these 5 different areas, and so we have also used those brain frames to create a tip sheet for how attorneys can engage youth. And then we also have a reference sheet that guides people through the federal laws that support some of this brain science. So we wanted to sort of walk you through all of these different pieces. So the first is that article that I mentioned, and the article has a brief summary of the science. It has a frame of these 3 R's that should guide practitioners through how to engage more authentically. There's also a legal overview, and then finally there are some practical tips for what attorneys can do in their practice with youth in care. I know that this may seem like a lot of text on the screen and might be hard for people to read, so the link itself is embedded in the PowerPoint, and so you'll all have access to the toolkit through that link. So no need to like rush and try to screenshot this right now. You'll all have access to this after. And then we also have those 5 brain frames that I was speaking about earlier around keeping the family conversation alive, maintaining connections to school and work, promoting safe and stable housing for young people, prioritizing healing, and supporting young parents. And so this is sort of mini case scenarios about things that are likely to come up in your practice and how attorneys can use and the courts can use brain science to respond and engage those youth in their own case planning. We also have case scenarios, which I think Kristin, or federal laws that Kristin will be walking us through.
Okay, thanks, Sneha. So yeah, as Sneha said, the PowerPoint is included in the handout section, so you can access the link there. You can also get that on our main americanbar.org/child page if you want to be able to look at these live. But the idea with this tool was really just to kind of do bite-sized pieces. We know how busy everyone that's representing children and families can be. And so we wanted to get the very high-level basics. This is in no way comprehensive, but it's designed to get some tools to support you in your day-to-day practice. So to that end, we have an overview of the relevant federal laws, and that is really just a 2-page. Obviously, there has been as Sue referenced, a lot of important federal law changes that are designed to support adolescents. And so this is really just sort of a tip sheet that includes citations that breaks down some of the major areas of law supporting youth engagement in their case planning, in their court hearings, in their transition planning, required documents. And it also talks about changes that have been made to another planned permanent living arrangement as a permanency goal. And then finally, some normalcy and age appropriate activity discussion. So that is just a quick reference guide. The next tool that we developed that's available is a case scenario training document. And so we know how many people go to training, and what this is designed to be is sort of a train the trainer that talks about adolescent permanency. So the idea would be someone else would be providing the adolescent brain science overview, and then there would be sort of a walkthrough with the legal community, debriefing what they just heard within that overview and just really digging into some of these case scenarios. So there are 2 in the handout that are out there, Justine and Cody. And for each of the case scenarios, we have a series of discussion questions. And again, these are just screenshots to show you some of the ideas that are included in the full document. So there's discussion questions for each of the case scenarios. We also, under each of them, have some of the key discussion themes that should be discussed. So it's really sort of a facilitator guide of things that you should be asking and things that should be coming out within the group as you're facilitating. There's also, for each of the case scenarios, some of the legal advocacy questions that you should be asking the group. So what are the things that you're doing before the hearing and after the hearing to make sure that you're authentically engaging youth and understanding their adolescent development and needs? And then finally, for each of the case scenarios, because the 2 case scenarios cover sort of a wide variety of topics, we also have just some samples of the relevant supporting laws for each of those to just sort of walk through with the audience and have people share what they would use in their own advocacy. So as I said, these are just a few tools that are designed to give the basic information about adolescent brain science for the legal community. There's certainly a lot more that can be done and that we're hoping to be working on. So this was just a first way to get some of the information out there. The Center on Children and the Law at the ABA has spent decades really advocating for youth engagement, for adolescent permanency. This is just sort of the latest document that we have out there on that. A lot of the previous work that we've done in this area, or tools or resources specifically on youth engagement or youth engagement in court, are included in the original article that Sneha mentioned. So I really encourage you to look at that, not only for sort of the content of the article, but we have both ABA, Annie E. Casey, and a variety of other reference tools that are really helpful for you if you want to read and learn more about this topic. We really encourage you, Sneha and I, and the entire Center on Children and the Law, to reach out. We are available if you have questions or needs on this topic. This is something that we see really a direct link in terms of how the legal community is able to better support adolescents. And we're hoping that better knowledge of this important brain science is going to really move forward actual implementation of making program and policy change. So thank you. Prudence, I'll turn it over to you to wrap up.
Perfect. Thank you, Kristin and Sneha. And I'm going to tackle one of the questions that came up because I think it's an excellent question that really does bridge both the sort of more global advocacy and also the direct question about what all this means for engagement in cases. And so the question that came in is, what does this research suggest regarding the involvement of adolescents approximately ages 13 to 17 in their cases, including planning, participation in meetings, participation in court hearings, and sort of how can this brain science work be used to continue to advocate for the importance of youth participation and active engagement in their cases?
I think it's a great question. I think that it's one that I see the brain science and the documentation of what I think so many people have seen in practice for so many years, but more importantly, what the youth with lived experience have been telling us for years, which is that they really feel like they weren't empowered or involved, as all the adults around them were handling their case for them and not treating them as partners. So I think the main takeaway, and Sue referenced this earlier in the great work that they've been doing at Juvenile Law Center as well as National Academy of Sciences, is treating youth and adolescents as partners, I think, is fundamental to advocacy for them. I think that having them feel like they're actively involved and engaged and that they can trust the people that are advocating for them is fundamental to making sure that the partnership will actually move forward. I think secondarily, just based on what Leslie talked about in such great detail and with so many good examples, is that they need to have time to process things, and they need to be able to work through things, not just with the adults on their case, but also with their peers, because at that time, that peer sort of relationship and feeling, you know, how the people around them can relate, or how they can relate to the people around them, is so important. And so that's why I think that making sure that the advocates that are working with youth are not just working with just the youth, but that they're also building the relationships with that extended family, the sibling connections, and the friends that are important, to make sure that the youth is getting the rights and services that they so desperately need, both for permanency and also for that transition to adulthood.
Great, thank you, Kristin. Sneha, did you have anything that you wanted to add for that?
I think one of the things that we've heard over and over again is from youth is really the importance of those sort of practices around normalcy, and advocating as zealously as possible for that, because Sue touched on this before, that the system is really built to take care of younger kids. But what we end up doing is infantilizing youth by making a lot of decisions for them and not letting them kind of stretch their legs and make decisions for themselves. And then when they exit care, they're supposed to be fully formed adults that have never been able to make any decisions for themselves. So letting them have those normal childhood experiences, normal adolescent experiences, and advocating for that is something that youth have really highlighted as something that's important to them.
That's fantastic, and I think actually ties in with a question that I hadn't gotten a chance to relay to all of you yet, but that was a question from the earlier session about the specifics of the specific question was about swimming as an activity, but I think the general question is sort of, should participation in activities that meet an adolescent's interests and needs be prioritized as part of making sure that that youth, while they are in the child welfare system, are being treated as the decision makers, and as the individuals, as they emerge to adulthood, the individuals who they are. I think you covered that in the answer about normalcy, but I really like that the question was so specific, because I think it really does underscore the importance of listening to kids about the activities that they would find satisfying and fulfilling for themselves as they continue through this period. Well, thank you, all of the presenters. It's been a privilege to have this opportunity to have you all on this panel and this discussion. But much beyond the webinar, thank you also to everyone on today's webinar for the work that you've done in this area. I think the fact that the webinar was so popular in terms of registration and attendance really underscores that there is a hunger out there for this information and for being able to use it to better serve the age range of adolescents in the legal system. And so thank you for all of the work that you did going into this. For anyone who wants to sort of continue to track information and resources that we're working on through the ABA, I have some of the information on your screen of how to get additional resources and information from us. And we encourage you to follow us and check back in, and likewise with the other panelists and presenters. So thank you, everyone, and thank you to the listeners as well for the work that we know you're going to continue to do, and for the work that you'll do on implementing some of this important science. Take care.